Oh, hi everybody. I'm Alison Collins. I work at Pollen Street Capital. Pollen Street is a London-based asset manager with about 70 people, predominantly based in the UK, but with a small team in the US. We have a focus on specialist finance and business services, and about half our AUM is in private equity and half is in credit. We have a really strong focus and culture of ESG at Pollen Street. And I became head of ESG 2 years ago. And the reason I became head of ESG is I work in what we call the hub. The hub is a small team of people based in the firm. We work across the firm and across the portfolio, both private equity and credit, to really think about how we can get synergies and best practice. And ESG really sort of sits naturally within the hub because we can sort of think about the program and the investment process we have across the firm. But more importantly, it's how we then really drive the best impact and outcomes across the portfolio. And part of that is through the sort of collaborative approach to address opportunities and challenges together, and also to share best practice, because firms are all at different stages of maturity, but we can all learn from each other.
Thanks, Alison. I'm Matt Sparks. I'm head of sustainability at Linklaters. We'll talk about my job title and why it's not ESG a bit later, perhaps. Linklaters is a global law firm, about 5,000 people, half of whom are in London. We're a corporate law firm, so we help businesses grow, raise funds, protect their property, whatever it might be, all sorts of stuff. And yeah, I've been there for 10 years now. Originally, sort of corporate responsibility, responsible business, sustainability. So really have seen the landscape evolve dramatically over that time, but no faster. I mean, the fastest has been over the past 6 to 12 months, where we've seen some really radical change.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for the introduction, and thanks for being here. It's much appreciated to have you and sharing your expertise with you. And as Alison was mentioning, we can all learn plenty from each other, and it's a field that needs a lot of attention at the moment to be properly understood and explored. So I'm going to start with some of the questions and then have a little bit of a conversation. We will have most of them are questions for both of you. So whoever wants to go first and answer, just turn on your mic and go for it. But one that is pretty, broad, but I think is a good way to start and kick off is, what do you see as the challenges that are at the moment around communicating ESG? So of course we know that there is a lot of layered complexity about it, and there is also an element of the fact that some people don't even understand exactly, what it means, and the definition can be fuzzy. So I would love to hear a little bit about what you on a day-by-day see as, okay, when you're talking about ESG, what are the comms challenges that I see? Let's start there, and then we'll keep the conversation going. So who wants to go first?
I can go first. It's interesting because I think we appointed actually a comms manager earlier this year, and I think that probably the majority of her time since she joined has been on ESG related communications, mostly external but also internal. And I think that there's a lot of communications out there about ESG, and a lot of it is quite samey. So I think it's about this sort of, really is, thinking about, the topic for today. It is about authenticity and originality in ESG comms, and it's about keeping it real. It's about taking it back to how does the sort of the ESG story relate to the business and the strategy and the culture of business, because ultimately there are sort of, there are the tick box elements you have to do from an ESG perspective, and that's expected, and you obviously can communicate about that. But where you really get sort of engagement with communications, I think it's where you say keep it real and link it to the tangible impact that's relevant to the business. So that's sort of the key challenge is actually is that relevance and authenticity. There's also obviously the whole data aspect as well. There's increasing needs for transparency. There is a lot of complexity, as you said. and how do we sort of back up the assertions when there is some complexity in data and metrics, and also, more importantly, the availability of consistent data to benchmark ESG across different businesses, different sectors, different geographies.
Gotcha. Thanks, Alison, for that. I think that I would love to talk about that balance between data and story in a bit. Matt, anything particularly vexing on your plate when it comes to challenges here?
Yeah, I think the phrase challenge, and it's a virtuous circle or a vicious circle, I think, depending on your perspective. A virtuous one for me is that, the more you put out stories of responsibility, the higher expectations are of your business and the greater scrutiny there is of your business. So as a law firm that's a partnership, we don't have to report very much publicly at all. We're having to get used to the idea of that we have to report like a business in this regard. Being a partnership is no excuse not to share your story and share your numbers as much as anybody else. But also by doing that, we're inviting more, as I say, more scrutiny, more observation, more review of what we're doing. And in a firm where, and to be honest, we still do advise clients who maybe are taking a slower path to sustainability, that raises some sort of existential questions for the firm. And that's a challenge because on the one hand, we don't want not to be doing this stuff well. Our own ESG programs need to be strong and best in classes. It's the right thing to do. It's what many stakeholders expect. But it's sort of a challenge that the more accountable and public you are with this activity, and rightly, the more interested people are in how you reconcile that with everything that you do across your business. And I think that's a real challenge because, as I say, you don't want to undersell the good stuff that you're engaged in, because the world is becoming more transparent and more accountable. And if you don't put it there, somebody will find it. So it's much better to be proactive. But by doing that, the bar is constantly rising, and at some point it hits some of the stuff. Whether you're in, the ad industry, retail, or whatever it is, that bar eventually is going to start to bump into things that some people are less happy with, and I think that becomes a real challenge.
That's an interesting topic, actually. I think because there is especially with social reviews out there now, things like Glassdoor, Trustpilot, there is so much information out there, so you need to make sure that you're sort of that you have that consistency in communication, and you aren't making an assertion and then actually somebody goes onto Glassdoor or Trustpilot and actually the reality doesn't match up to those assertions that you're communicating.
That's your point about keeping it real, right, Alison, and that consistency. I mean, my second question was around risk, so I think that is a fantastic segue, and thanks, Matt, for sort of flagging that aspect of you have the internal and external, and the fact that the bigger your organization are, the more difficult it is to make sure that every single individual within it reflects the sort of ethical approach, if you want. So in terms of those risks, I think that there are almost like two aspects of it. I think one is the one that you were mentioning before, Matt, is like you constantly raise the bar, and I think that the commitment to ESG, what does that mean? I think is an interesting thing, and how do you deal with that fuzziness of the definition? And it would be interesting to know how you both deal with that. And the other one is, I think specifically for Alison, because you work with finance and investment, and when it comes to intangible assets, have you found it more important to communicate the aspect of policies and let's say ambitions and what you want to do versus the results and how that plays out? So we already discussed a little bit about those the internal versus external risk, but if you can add a little bit more color to that, that would be great.
For me to talk, I'll go first this time.
Go for it.
So on the risk word itself, I think is quite interesting because we talk. A lot of the conversation around ESG at the moment is about risk, managing climate change risk, pandemic risk, whatever it might be. And I think it'd be more helpful if we spoke about the opportunities rather than the risks. because certainly, we have an ESG practice at the firm, which is growing, particularly across was always been strong on the E and the G, but the S2 now. And there are plenty of opportunities there. Yes, it is about reducing risk and mitigating risk, but equally there are, as Alison will know sort of more than most, there's plenty of opportunity out there. So I think turning on his head's quite helpful. I think you're right. I mean, you briefly mentioned sort of the definition and the ESG term. I think, I guess obviously ESG is about being a responsible business in all aspects of how you behave, how you operate, and then looking at other businesses through the same lens if you're in that space. So I think that we can get very hung up on definitions. Certainly one of the greatest challenges we face within the firm, and it's a risk to us, is that we spend a lot of time talking about what is and what isn't ESG, and what is and what isn't green, what's green and what's brown, what's olive and what's greeny brown and what's browny green. And you get so caught up in the process, you forget about the outcome and the product. And I think actually, and going to your final point actually about policies versus sort of action or metrics, I think we've seen a shift. I've seen a shift when clients come to us and ask us about what we're up to in this space, between have you got a policy, have you got a web page, can you show me what your plan is, to show me the numbers. So arguably, CR, because corporate responsibilities it used to be, was sort of an art, and ESG has brought the science, the metrics. Now it's much more about show me your numbers and actually show me your targets. And that's, again, a significant shift. They're less interested in what we've done before than where we're going, and that we're accountable for where we're going. So I think things have turned quite quickly into something that's as strategic as any other part of the business, actually.
And do you think that is, I mean, it's kind of a provocative question, but the fact that there has been that shift is a good thing, a bad thing? I imagine a little bit of a mix of both, but this aspect of like what type of our data is interesting, and to what degree do you collect it versus have a sort of behavioral aspect, within the company. I think it's an interesting balance.
I think across businesses and within businesses, you as I sort of mentioned before, you either see this as a good thing or a slightly challenging thing. Because if you're on the side of, well, actually, the more you report, the more accountable you are, the more you'll continue down the path. And to a degree, that sort of the higher standards you'll set for yourself, the tougher you'll make it for yourself. Then this is all progress and all a very good thing. If you're sitting in the camp, or you're in a business where actually you want to make hay while the sun shines, for want of a better expression, more data is not a good thing, because you're opening yourself up to far more scrutiny. Not, as I say, not only on that data, but on the next set of data people expect you to churn out. And you're always going to be lagging behind the leaders, who will be always, constantly finding new ways to self-analyze, I guess. So I do think it's very difficult. But I would say this, sort of working for a law firm, more and more the legislation is chasing the trends. So actually, you may be a leader now, but if you're a laggard, you'll find that the rules are going to sweep you up down the line more often than not. So I think the other angle to this is, you can be proactive and win some points for being proactive, or you can be reactive and go quietly, I guess. So our view is, wherever we can, to be proactive, because if it's coming down the line anyway, it's surely better to be at the front than the back.
Makes sense. Thanks, Matt. That's like a great reflection, and also a positive one for the future about being proactive rather than just reactive. Alison, sorry, I was focusing on you with a specific question about finance.
Yeah, no, but I totally agree. Actually, I totally agree with what Matt says. Legislation is following the trends, but it and obviously we shouldn't be doing something because of legislation. We should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. However, it is good to get ahead, because in 2 years' time, when we have to report on all these metrics for the SFDR, we need to start on that journey now, so that we're prepared. And that obviously, if you have a portfolio, that means we've got to start working with our credit partners, our private equity companies, to sort of make sure that we've got really good data quality ahead of that time. So it's a key part of the role of the sort of like the ESG function to do that piece of work. Going back to the questions you asked me about policy versus sort of outcome, I suppose. I think it's an interesting thing, linking also back to what Matt said, is that we are seeing a move from sort of this risk, ESG being sort of a risk management perspective, to actually more of the value creation perspective. And I think that's what, when we communicate on ESG, that's the element we focus in on. Obviously, having a policy is an ESG fundamental, and obviously, and we our investor, our customers are our investors. They obviously ask us, do you have an ESG policy? Can you provide your ESG policy to us? And we can do that. It's on our website. We also have on the statutory policies, diversity and inclusion policies, and et cetera, et cetera. But the policy is more about the sort of the intent around it. And I think it's then demonstrating the journey you're going on, and then that obviously leads to certain outcomes. And it obviously, and as you say, policy versus outcome, it depends where you are on your ESG, in terms of ESG maturity as well. It starts with the policy, it starts then creating a framework, working out priorities. And I keep on saying, it goes back to focusing on where it's relevant to your business. And then obviously you can communicate and to bring it to life, linked to that tangible impact. You can use case studies, examples, as well as those sort of like the metrics. And you can then focus in on a sort of like a core set of metrics that are more meaningful, backed up by, tangible stories. And that's what people engage with, is those stories, not necessarily like, what your gender pay gap, especially in financial services, which is still always going to be high. But it's then demonstrating what are we doing to sort of like minimize that over time. I think the other thing is as well, I think it's also about setting targets, meaningful targets, and then demonstrating progress, even if it's just incremental, because, we're not necessarily, as I said, with the gender pay gap, we're not going to minimize it immediately. It's going to be a longer term process. And I think, it still does go back to that authentic communication, having reporting that is, that engages the different audiences. You just always got to think about your audience as well and what they're after. So policy is important, but it goes hand in hand with the impact and the outcomes.
No, it makes sense, and that aspect of humanizing it, but always having the backup of the numbers, I think it's very important. We notice it with the work we do with our clients is always a little bit of that balance where you have a big start is an important achievement, but then if you leave it there just as a start, nobody will care, and then you have to say, what does this mean for the people that are out there? And this is humans engage with humans in the end of the day. So that's one of the big differences there. Sorry, Matt, I was cutting you there.
That's what I was just picking up on this point about targets, because it strikes me that there are two types of targets. Some are sort of defined for you. So we've just signed up to science-based targets, which are for carbon reduction. You've got to be on a 1.5 degree C pathway, and we've got to be aligned to that. So the work is done for you there. But on things like diversity, where it's a little bit more fluid, perhaps, I think you've got to be quite careful around whether you set a stretching target or an achievable target, because there's quite a lot of debate about, is a stretching target that you nearly meet better than a weak one that you do? But of course, in the communication space, I think some of the subtlety of a stretch target gets lost. So I do think there's, amongst our peers, there are slightly different approaches. And I would, for the business, a stretch target is much better, because you try harder and you get further than you would have done. I'm no comms expert, but I suspect for comms, a softer target, which you can hit out the park, is stronger. So I think that's a difficult one in terms of target setting. Or you follow your peers and hope for the best.
There is also a matter of size, I think, that is very important. When when we think about, I often scratch my head on our group that is a small one, compared by the size of many of the clients that we have, and thinking about how to demonstrate some aspects. I think that there is an element of statistically relevant, that can only happen at a certain type of size, and that's something that, in a sense, when thinking about comms, I think that the bigger you are, the harder it should be in terms of target, and not to realize their target, like having that clarity, of what something is, and that small organizations can try their best, but sometimes don't even have the opportunity to have enough to assess, to a degree, and it becomes more of a attitude and set of soft rules versus the hard aspect of it. To that point, I think it's interesting to move on to the next topic that is connected to it, and is like, a lot of people are talking about greenwashing, pointing people out, as you were saying. You put your policy there, you're out there, and somebody says, this smells like greenwashing, or even worse, rainbow washing when it comes to specific topics. Do you have any sort of advice or approach or now to sort of avoid that aspect, and how do you deal, I guess, with that, and what used to be sustainability reports that were something that were out, and how have they changed, if in any way?
Do you want to go first, Alison?
Okay. So it's an interesting topic, and again, I think it does go back to what you were just talking about in terms of size and materiality as well. I mean, we've got in Pollen Street, so we have an impact framework which we use, which we base off the ESG factors which we feel are relevant and important to us. So that includes things like financial inclusion, regional economic growth, environmental impact, strong governance, and diversity and inclusion. And I think what we tend to do is, rather than sort of say, oh yeah, we're going to be carbon, looking at the greenwashing and thinking about the environmental stuff, it's actually what we do is we focus our ESG efforts on areas where we can have an impact. And also what we've also got to factor in is that not every business is going to be able to meet all of those impact areas. So, we said we focus in on what's relevant to those businesses. We link through metrics, targets, and activities to those aspects, as well as thinking about the overall sort of ESG program and becoming, as Matt said, a better, more responsible business. And I think if you sort of link it back to that sort of framework that's practical, that you can drive tangible progress and impact, that can help sort of counter those sort of greenwashing, rainbow washing aspects that you've spoken about. And then from a sort of reporting standpoint, it goes back to that proactivity again and consistency. You say we don't want some, if you talk about sort of like responsibility to your staff and diversity and inclusion, you don't want somebody going to Glassdoor and that not being the case. So it's making sure that, you are consistent across all your communications and your activities.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think in Alison's point, I think frameworks, standards, benchmarks, indices, whatever you want to use, some external credibility to what you're doing helps. So it's fine talking about something, but if you can align yourself to a standard, if you can achieve in an index, if you're part of a accepted framework and you're doing it properly, that undoubtedly helps. But of course, the flip side is, again, if you're holding yourself to those standards and you don't achieve them, or you slip up, the repercussions are significant. So I think the greenwashing, there's two parts of greenwashing. One is making sure that your claims and your engagement stands up, and that is external credibility and fairly clear metrics, fairly clear reporting. But then, of course, it's making sure that the business is doing the right thing and behaving itself, because that could also be seen as greenwashing. I don't want to preempt. I won't preempt the question. I see a question's come in about brands who are getting this right, but it does occur to me that most of the brands who you might say have been getting this right have also been caught out for getting bits of it wrong. And I was thinking of IKEA particularly just recently around private investigators. Now, you may or may not think that's particularly important in the context of all the very good things that they do, but it knocked their brand. It didn't knock greenwashing, but certainly in terms of reputation, it was challenging. So I think it's quite interesting. I think greenwashing, you know, there is a bit around here about, you know, no matter how hard you try, it's quite easy to fall over. So linked to that, I think narrative for communications professionals, getting a narrative that can accommodate that is key and hard.
To that point, I think is an interesting thing to attach it to some of the questions, like, you know, what you know, we have an audience question: what brands and organization do a good job? But I would like to build up on that and say, who do you think also does a good job at owning their mistakes and dealing with them in an open way? Because you know, the worst thing is when something happens, articles fly around, and you have this kind of wall of silence on a brand side or on an organization side. Yeah, is there anybody that you think does a particularly good job on one side, or some things, maybe without mentioning names, depending on how comfortable you feel, that has done a not so great job? I mean, in my experience, what we see is that timing is such an important factor, meaning that there is a window of time that sometimes is found as acceptable to deal and respond to some of these things, and then there is just a moment where it starts dipping, and people are like, "What's happening? Why there's no response, or what is that is going on behind the scenes?" So it would be great to know if you've seen any good or bad cases. Let me put it like that.
That's one to reflect. Might be one to reflect on. I give a general answer to start with, which I think is that I don't think there's enough acknowledgement. Well, I don't think there's enough acknowledgement that it's hard to get these things 100% right. So I do think it's right to get out there and face the, you know, accept the problem, apologize, address it. I do think it would be helpful in situations like that to sort of emphasize that this isn't always easy. You're not going to be at 100% immediately. You are still going to step up. I mean, I think the perception and the difficulty is you sign up to something or you make a statement, and that you, almost overnight you go to sort of, you become infallible, basically, and that's clearly nonsense. You know, you're no different the next day than you were the day before. The same individuals may make the same mistakes as the day before, but the expectation suddenly goes from here to here, or more likely, actually, some people's opportunity to catch you out goes from here to here. So what I don't think there's enough of is statements that sort of say, well, hang on a minute, you know, this is pretty hard, you know, almost to the point, you know, when you started that diet in January, you're telling me you've never had a cake since, sort of thing, which you couldn't very well do. But that sort of, which is the principle, you know, that we're on a pathway, on a journey. It's not 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but there will be slips, and, you know, we'll learn from them and we'll move on. And I don't think there's enough communication around that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to sort of reflect and come back with a strong, proactive response that acknowledges the challenge. I think is really key. We run a crisis management function at the firm, which in itself brings challenges to me, because, of course, you know, one of our clients in crisis tends to mean often they've upset somebody somewhere, which means it'll probably upset quite a lot of other people and quite a lot of other places too. So from an ESG perspective, that's quite an interesting function to handle, I guess. But the crisis management advice is, you know, an informed, considered, sensible response. And obviously, being a law firm, don't say too much. But I don't think we see enough of an acknowledgement that this is actually hard. And it's not going to happen just like that, but the direction of travel is positive.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think, you know, I mean, again, reflect on different brands who've done it well or done it badly. I mean, if you think about sort of like the largest ESG crisis we've had over the last 18 months was COVID. And I think the firms that actually had probably good crisis management processes in place ahead of COVID and thought about their different stakeholders, their customers, their suppliers, their colleagues and staff. Actually, the ones who sort of like had processes in place to think about their stakeholders, they're the ones who have actually done well over the last 18 months. That has had a massive impact on their brands, their sort of employee engagement and customer engagement as well.
I think it's very interesting what you're both mentioning, because I almost see these two macro trends. Individuals, there is so much understanding, or it might be a fake understanding, but if you open LinkedIn today, there is a lot of like, oh, you've been so brave for taking holiday, and all sorts of these aspects that I think are part of a reinforcing messages to acknowledge that we're human. And then organizations made of people are, I think that we have this idea that they need to be far more perfect than the individuals that make them up, but that ambition often clashes with the fact that it's very difficult to admit as an organization. Or as you say, Matt, we are fallible, and that's not something to be ashamed of, and we're owning that aspect. I find it quite interesting that trying to get through comms team the I'm going to use a trending word, the vulnerability aspect, and apply it to companies, and that's not something that is happening as much as is happening with individuals, and I can imagine a number of reasons for that. But do you guys have any thoughts about that bit, and how you can present a human face?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's an interesting one. We're in financial services, and we have recently sort of redefined our values, very much thinking about sort of the ESG lens and our culture. And we actually incorporate into our values caring, which is quite bold for an asset manager, but it's about how we really care and go the extra mile for our various different stakeholders. And I think that sort of caring aspect is very important in both driving the sort of the culture of ESG, but also how you tell the story and engage your stakeholders as well. It's sort of really sort of working for us, that sort of value of caring, and that really does come from the top. And then we sort of like permeate that across sort of like the management teams of our portfolio companies as well. So it actually sort of like pervades the entire sort of portfolio.
Yeah, just building on that, I think that increasingly too, the sort of the internal comms certainly needs to be as strong as the external, because you need your people to understand where you're going. To a degree, they need to be your eyes and ears really on what's going on within the business. And it isn't about whistleblowing, but it's about helping people make the right decisions along the way. And I'll go back to our science-based targets. One of our challenges is going to be travel, because the lawyers travel a lot around the world, sometimes often in the front of the plane rather than the back, more often than not. And we're not saying don't do that anymore. Don't strap yourself to the top of the plane. You can still fly well, but it's quality over quantity. So, do you need to make that journey in that way so often, for example? Now, we can't keep an eye on thousands of people, but their colleagues can, and can sort of say, well, hang on, it's the third time you've done that this month. Wouldn't it be better to wrap those two trips up into one, bearing in mind this, that, and the other? So we're relying on people to do the right thing and to help others do the right thing. I'll put it positively like that. But they'll only know that if we make it clear to them what that is. And also why it's so important to us, because there are a lot of people get it. A lot of people, it still seems to be a surprise that any of this stuff is going on at all. So I do think, before you can get people to change, you need to make them aware. And, I think those of us in a bit of a bubble of awareness forget sometimes that for a lot of people, I think maybe this goes back to your comment about individuals versus corporate. They walk through the door of the building, and the sort of their personal responsibility is left there too. They leave it all up to the business. And I think for something like this, that isn't true. It's the actions of each individual that reflect upon the organisation.
I think that's a great point in general, not only for ESG as a human statement on that aspect. But this leads me to a point that we have further on, but I think is interesting, especially because I see some questions coming. But you have the three letters, you have the ESG aspect there, and in terms of balance, of course, we mentioned the environmental one. There is the governance one, and the social. How what is becoming, let's say, increasingly important to communicate? I feel that very often when we work with clients, there is a lot of focus on E, and because it's more tricky or sometimes a little bit less defined, that yes is left a little bit aside. Alison, if you want to start having a little bit of a comment there about how do you balance the letters?
Very interesting comment. So for us, the G we do because it's a core part of our business. A lot of our businesses we work with and ourselves, we're highly regulated. So but the G is very important. Actually, to me, that sort of sits at the centre of everything. It's also about leadership, and that's about setting the tone, setting the culture. So yeah, you can have all your policies and frameworks and committees in place, but it's then about how the G also, to me, is also about the communication as well. So we do that as a matter of course. The E is very important. We get obviously a lot of scrutiny from our investors and our stakeholders on this, and we've recently been through a whole sort of massive carbon footprinting exercise across our portfolio. And we will be we're setting targets. We're looking at sort of like the different activities we can do for our carbon reduction strategy. However, we are in a financial services businesses, we are sort of relatively asset light. So there's only so much we can do from the environmental impact perspective. Although we are now starting to look at products and services that can help individuals and businesses sort of transition to a greener future. So financing electric vehicles, energy efficient homes, renewable energy initiatives through our sort of our lending partners. So we have actually realised that we can have more of an impact than we initially thought, because we will actually we don't have much, we don't know in manufacturing or sort of energy or mining or anything. But then actually really what we feel actually where we can have more of an impact is on the S. And that it's obviously been gaining a lot more prominence, as I said, through COVID, the sort of focus on the sort of like this sort of the social and economic inequalities that exist out there, and that's where we can really sort of help with areas such as financial inclusion, access to finance, regional economic growth, and obviously as we talked about the sort of the DE&I, diversity, equality and inclusion area as well. And so I think this is an area where we've also been doing a lot of communications and reporting on, but it doesn't get much from a communication standpoint. There isn't not that much out there when you look at ESG. And the other thing I would probably sort of say is, I think there's all these acronyms E, S, and G, and I'm sure Matt's going to talk about this in a second because he mentioned that earlier. But it is actually more about the sort of sustainability and responsibility rather than putting a specific sort of capital letter against it. But that's our take. Is S is very important to us.
Yeah, I better pick up on that then. So yeah, I think the E is more straightforward in terms of definition, because it's quite well advanced. There are plenty of frameworks. Everybody knows what good looks like. Certainly on the carbon reduction piece, anyway. Less so on biodiversity and one or two other things, but there's more structure around it. Governance, I think, is really about bringing out into the public domain probably what you've had internally for many years. That might be a cultural shift. And it might mean you need to strengthen what you've produced internally. But if you're willing to share the way you structure yourself, protect yourself, make sure you're running a strong organisation, then that's more straightforward. I think the S is interesting because I think there's two sides to the S. There's sort of the internal and the external. And I've heard quite a lot of people say that there's an E missing from ESG, which is the employee, the people, basically. Because I think the social is internally how you look after your people, the diversity, the well-being, the remuneration, the training, the everything else that needs to fit in there. And that's the story of interest to some stakeholders, but not all. I think the external S, the social, has become more important because of the pandemic. I think a lot of people still stall at or get stuck on the idea if it's about giving back, it's your social, it's your giving. And I don't like giving back anyway, because we always make the argument we haven't taken away, so there's nothing to give back. You know, it's the wrong expression. It creates an impression that you are sucking the system and then giving a little bit back. So I don't think it's helpful. But I think the more interesting bit of the S, which links to things like the Sustainable Development Goals and other things, which I think will come to the fore, will be how our business is contributing to making society stronger, more prosperous, fairer, and everything else. So I think it would be very positive if the S became, well, actually, what are you investing in infrastructure? You know, what infrastructure are you enabling? What are you doing that improves our cities? What are you doing that improves the sort of the land and the water and everything, but through the day job? You know, how is your mainstream work making a stronger world around us? We have a purpose statement or purpose, delivering legal certainty in a changing world, which, as these things go, isn't bad. It's largely what we do. And I think, you know, if we would like that, a lens to be applied to that, I guess. So actually, yeah, that's a reasonable purpose. You are giving back. Sorry, I've said it myself now. You are contributing to sort of a more sustainable future by what you do, by creating, you know, a reliable, robust legal system through which the world, you know, trade and, you know, business can be conducted. So I think S has a long way to go in terms of understanding. I think at the moment it's quite a tight definition about, as I say, broadly giving back. I think the pandemic has helped show quite how many more touch points there are between business and society. And I think business has to be a lot sharper in actually saying, well, actually, on that note, a lot of what we do, directly or more likely indirectly, is making many, many lives much, much better.
I think it's a great point, because you mentioned two things came to mind for me. One, we're running out of time, but I would love to understand from your point of view what COVID has changed on the ESG specific approach, but also in an idea of like how much can we actually monitor people, because it's not like you can take a decision about your office and things like that, and instead you have this, you know, now you have 5,000 people around, Matt, and you have 70 people around that maybe don't come that often to the office.
We have 70 people. We have about 5,000 people across our portfolio, though. So.
Oh, there you go. So yeah, it's like all these people affect the world in a different way, and their own, you know, or not. And I always find it very interesting how you have these conflicting narratives of you know, that those map of the world that is like, oh, never saw, you know, such small consumption of CO2 and stuff like that, and then stories of those people that decided to move to another place or work as traveling because that's finally possible. And now does that impact the ESG aspect? I think that's an interesting thing, because then from an S point of view, doing a great job, people are living their best life. I'm gonna take a poke at the term digital nomad, which I despise. This is gonna lose me some clients as I say that. And at the same time, we know that might not be environmentally great. And you know, that aspect of balancing a liquid world where maybe you meet your colleagues in person one a quarter rather than on a weekly basis. Is it something that you've been dealing with?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as we've mentioned, this sort of the employee piece and the welfare, health and well-being of employees, and obviously also their ultimate engagement has come to the fore over the last 18 months, and it's an interesting topic, because you have I mean, I've been back in the office now sort of about 3 days a week or so, and I've really enjoyed having, again, the interactions with my colleagues, having a cup of tea, having those side chats with people, understanding more about what's going on across the business, but also sort of like you understand sort of the opportunities for sort of like development and mentorship, because you can just ask somebody a question really easily rather than having to set up a Zoom call to sort of really just run something past somebody or just like ask their advice. So I think, going forward, as we look at new business operating models, or whether it's, remote, hybrid, fully in office, or whatever, you've got to think about the aspects that can maximize the benefits for your employees in terms of the different aspects, their mental health, their physical health, their development, their progression. How do you enable that with, and I think in a way it's easier for a bigger company than it is for a smaller company to sort of think about sort of wider programs. And I think that's really, really important going forward as a key component for ESG. And I'd love to hear what Matt's got to say about it too.
Well, thank you. I think that an interesting challenge, and again, it's from a comms and a management and everything else perspective, is a lot of people have spent a lot of time at home and have built up, and I'll use the word, let's say, domestic capital, if you like. They've new connections, more time at home, more connections than they've ever had before. They've invested more locally than they've ever done before, perhaps. And corporate capital, opposite, is probably reduced as such. And I wonder if, when we used to spend 5 days a week in the office, our corporate capital was sort of 100%. I suggest when we've been at home, it's gone down substantially and the domestic's gone up. My fear probably is that people come back on a return that's 3 days, 2 days, or something like that en masse, and you never get back up to the sort of corporate strength you had before. People's affinity is still there, but it's weaker because some of their affinity is every Tuesday they do this and every Thursday they do that, or whatever it is. And on a very small scale, part of my job is to look after all of our volunteering. A lot of our people are now volunteering at home, which means they're doing less through our corporate programs, which means our corporate programs are weaker, or will potentially will be weaker. That's that side of things is often the tip of the iceberg. It's what a lot of people see as our doing the right thing. There's a lot under it, as we've discussed already, but they see that as a sort of bellwether, a check on what we're doing. If that is weaker, not because people are doing less, but they're doing it somewhere else, that challenges the business and our communication and our numbers and our everything else. So I think there is a challenge post-COVID for lots of very good reasons. That the strength of the corporate is a little bit diluted because people are investing some of their brain power, their whatever, closer to home for more of the time.
No, that makes sense. I'm sure that we'll see some interesting narratives emerge and see what is best. We have 3 minutes away, so I'm afraid that despite the fact that we have many other questions to go through, also coming from the audience, I just want to say that this has been incredibly insightful, guys. Thanks, Alison, for making the time and sharing your insights. Thanks a lot, Matt. This was great from our point of view. As a reminder, we will release our ESG comms guide, and probably after asking your permission, we'll see and utilize some of the nuggets of wisdom that you share with us within the guide itself. So we will release it, I would say, in a week, in a week or so. But I would love to continue the conversation with each one of you. If you have any questions, or you find this particularly interesting, we might do more events around it. I think that this is really the tip of the iceberg about the type of discourse that would be the center of a lot of interesting conversation about comms out there for the future. So thanks again. Thanks for your time. You've been a fantastic panelist.
Thank you.
And thanks for everyone that has come.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.